morning, everyone. I am very grateful to the organizers for having brought me to this event. It has all the elements to be an extremely exciting meeting and also very likely a game-changing one. Our links with nature have always captured our imagination, but the ways in which we perceive them has changed dramatically in the past decades, particularly so in the context of environmental sciences. I will give a very short overview of that trajectory, and in doing so, I will illustrate with examples of major international environmental initiatives. And because time is short, I will inevitably cartoonize them in the process. So first, up to the 70s, nature was starkly separate from our undertaking. Nature was collateral damage from the great human enterprise, or it was idyllic wilderness that we protect by isolating it from us. So this is, in Georgina Macy's terminology, a nature for itself or a nature despite people model. And here, biodiversity is a fairly academic notion, the territory of ecologists, naturalists, and similarly airy-fairy types. Now, in the early 2000s, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment establishes its seminal concept of ecosystem services. Now, nature is important, is useful for the human undertaking. This is a nature for people model, and people here is a mostly homogeneous, generic humanity. And this is still strongly dominated by the paradigm of ecology, but economics start coming fast to the table. Many economists embrace it. Some governments also embrace it enthusiastically. Many social sciences and humanities shrink in horror. And here, biodiversity is important for us. Biodiversity, presented as species richness, is good in an unqualified way. It makes almost every ecosystem function and service better. Now, in the wake of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, some research groups around the planet start highlighting the fact that not every component of diversity is equally important for every ecosystem function or service. Not only that, they start highlighting that, of course, all these generic ecosystem services are good for all of us, but beyond that, different social actors in different places perceive and value and prioritize different ecosystem services. And in doing so, on the basis of those preferences and interests, they modulate, they deeply manipulate different aspects of nature, altering the capacity of nature to provide benefits to everyone involved. A typical example of this research program is our own work in central Argentina, where we studied how different social actors perceived and valued different ecosystem types and allocated different ecosystem services defined by themselves to those ecosystem types. Here, the colorful dots represent the different ecosystem services. And of course, different social actors perceive different ecosystem services and they value different ecosystem types differently. And of course, the ecosystem types that get protected or even expand across the landscape are not necessarily the ones with the largest number of ecosystem services for the widest section of society. They are the ones with the highest portion of power and agency capacity behind them. But this is an illustration of a growing movement of the social sciences to come closer to this table. But a tipping point in that movement is the publication of this report in 2013. In this report, the International Social Science Council makes some sort of manifesto saying, look guys, climate change is not just a natural science issue out there, it's deeply political, it's deeply social. We have to sit at that table. And the same becomes increasingly obvious for biodiversity and ecosystems. So in the early 2010s, IBES, the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, is established with a dizzyingly ambitious mandate to address all aspects of biodiversity and ecosystem services at the global to regional scales, considering natural sciences, social sciences, and not only that, also the different knowledge systems of stakeholders such as indigenous peoples and local practitioners. So this is definitely a peoples and nature approach. In order to start making justice to such mandate, the first thing IBES had to do is to define a conceptual framework. A conceptual framework is a bit of an intellectual meeting space, a scaffolding on which to organize different ideas and the work of very different people. And the first step in that definition was to identify what are the key issues we want to talk about that have meaning for everyone involved. They had to be fairly few and universal issues. So IBES has only 6 major elements represented by these boxes with names in black bold, and only 8 major linkages between those elements. So now we don't horrify social scientists anymore. We horrify almost everyone. But we know that all these elements and linkages are meaningful and relevant to all the stakeholders involved. And we know that because this is not the product of just an overnight making up in some prominent office. This is the product of a long process of fairly participatory co-construction. Some of the hallmarks of this framework are multidisciplinarity, multidimensionality, plurality, and multiple streams. One of the innovative aspects is the fact that institutions and government and social factors are now at the very heart of the model and connect to virtually all the other elements. But us, as societies, are not only in that box. I apologize. I can see now that the thing to be highlighted should be institutions and governance, not the box. I apologize. Anyway, we are not only on that box, on the box of institutions, we are deeply interwoven as a plural we in all the boxes and arrows. Another distinctive aspect is the fact that different knowledge systems are considered very explicitly. The different inclusive concepts represented in the boxes are supposed to work for everyone, so we can make all the different streams of knowledge interoperable, but they can be approached through different cultural and epistemic lenses. So, for example, the major inclusive category, nature, can be approached from mainstream ecology as biodiversity, ecosystems, biogeochemical cycles, evolutionary process, etc. But it can also be approached from very different perspectives, as Pachamama in the Andean cosmovision, as country in the Aboriginal Australian cosmovision, etc. The same is valid for good quality of life. And the same applies to nature's contributions to people. Nature's contributions to people is a key concept in the IPBES conceptual framework. Nature's contributions to people are all the good and bad things you get from nature as an individual or as a member of a society. And nature's contributions to people can be approached from the perspective of ecosystem goods and services, but it also can be approached from very different perspectives, for example, as nature's gifts and obligations. But not only the elements, the boxes, can be approached in a multi-knowledge system way, also the linkages between the elements. So all these numerous arrows that converge in the concept of nature contributions to people are fairly distinct and unilateral from the point of view of economics. The same is probably true from the point of view of ecology, but if we consider them from the perspective of other knowledge systems, they are fairly reciprocal, and in some cases they involve mutual care, responsibility, and agency. Another hallmark of the IPBES approach is the explicit consideration of multiple values. Of course, monetary value is on the table, as well as other economic values, but there's also explicit consideration of intrinsic values and a very wide range of other social values. This approach has strong conceptual affinities and I would say compatibility with the multiple evidence-based approach presented by Maria Tengo and colleagues a couple of years ago, in the sense that there is consideration of multiple threads of evidence and perspectives, and the idea that these perspectives that are considering on equal footing interweave and converge into an enriched picture. Now, most of us are now at the stage represented by the circle there. We have the vision, we recognize the need of the streams, we bring the streams together, and we expect a richer picture to emerge. But how is this going to emerge in some consistent picture or set of pictures from which practical options can be derived? How does it work? It's a little bit like the different plugs and sockets and electricity systems you find when you travel around the world. You may celebrate the diversity or hate it. You may take an interest in what are the contextual, practical, or historical reasons for them. But if you have to work quickly with your computer to get some work done, you have to make the whole thing work fast, even if it's untidy, even if it's precarious. And then eventually you can try to find a much more elegant and streamlined solution. So this is a bit of a representation of part of the process so far. So, will this approach work in practice? To be very honest, I don't know. And I don't know because it's a huge experiment that is carried out as we speak. But so far, we can still recognize some challenges involved in the interweaving of different disciplines and knowledge systems that may be relevant to the Pecs community. These are some of the challenges. First, different knowledge systems and even different disciplines within science are only partially interoperable. They don't really fit 100%. They don't really fit in scale, in intent, in context of validation. Also, there are still very large asymmetries in between knowledge systems. They are asymmetric in terms of social recognition, in terms of the degree of organization of the communities of practices, etc. These are not very straightforward to deal with, but we are confident that if we keep trying along these lines, we eventually will arrive at a richer, more fair, more legitimate, more empowering solution. In other words, if we keep doing this experiment, one day it will not explode anymore. It may even grow feathers and fly. But even if the issues of interoperability and knowledge asymmetries would be completely solved, there will still be a very much more difficult issue, which is asymmetries of power. The design of what the questions are, the design of what the options are, is a knowledge issue, but it's also a power issue. And the implementation on the ground, what gets done and doesn't get done, is mostly a power dynamic issue. And wherever there is power, there is conflict. And in this great collective process in which I'm learning so much, I have the feeling that we treat conflict a little bit like the elephant in the room. We just pretend it's not there. We talk a lot about win-win. We talk a lot about cross-fertilization, about the richer picture, about synergy, everybody smiling. And of course, that's very important, right? But we shouldn't be naive. Conflict is unavoidable in these kind of things. Therefore, I think we should address it explicitly. Thank you very much.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, of course, and an honor to be here at Pecs 2 to share a couple of reflections and some of the work that we've been doing the last years, exploring global drivers and impacts on social ecological systems on the ground. And it's also very nice to be back at Pecs 2 because I think we sort of launched our work at Pecs 1 in South Africa. So this is sort of a follow-up of that work. What we've been doing the last years, which is not a very easy task, is to explore the role of financial capital and financial actors and how they shape the Earth system and the biosphere. And by that I mean sort of a general gut feeling that big banks, institutional investors, development banks, etc., play a role in shaping ecosystems, but being a bit unclear of how and to what extent and where in the world. So this is a bit of an explorative work that we've been doing that I want to follow up on. And one very exciting topic that I know you will all love, taxes. So we'll talk about taxes, but more in detail about something called tax havens or financial secrecy jurisdictions. You've probably seen that in the news the last days, the Appleby leak or the Paradise leaks. And there were several leaks like that. The Panama Papers, something called the Swiss leaks, etc., which sort of have provided an insight into what people call the tax haven economy. And just to be clear, it's not a small economy. It's actually becoming a big part of the global economy. And the challenge for us as a community, as we started to explore this, what are the implications for social ecological change on a big scale? So that's what we try to get at in this work. The first picture I showed you, sort of as an intro, is from an art project by Paulo Woods and Gabriele Galimberti. What they did, they set up a shell company which is super easy to do. It's not very expensive. And then went around the world, traveled around the world to photograph what sort of tax havens look like. So this image is from Singapore Freeport. And what you see are high security vaults. So if you're very wealthy, you have gold or paintings or whatever, you can take a flight and then just keep it safe from other people. Of course, the economy is not, it's more and more digital in a sense. You don't need to stash away physical objects anymore. You just need to use advances in information and communication technology and have good accountants. And then that's an opportunity for you to do transactions in this world. The term tax haven is very contested. It's debated. Some people call them financial secrecy jurisdictions. You can also find the term offshore finance, etc. You can find them in different parts of the world. The most famous ones are probably the ones in the Caribbean. So when you mention the word tax haven, you think about an exotic island somewhere in Asia or Oceania or the Caribbean, as mentioned, but also Europe, to be honest. So European countries or jurisdictions like Monaco, Cyprus. Sorry, Albert, about that. Luxembourg, Jersey, etc. The things they have in common, to simplify this a bit, are two things. First of all, by using a jurisdiction like that, you can pay low or even no taxes on the capital that you move. So that's the first component. The second one has to do with financial secrecy, meaning that it's possible to hide away the owner of a certain sort of capital if you place them under some of these jurisdictions. So that's the role, to reduce financial transparency. So I'm going to give you a bit of an example of how this works, and I'm going to assume that we set up a banana company somewhere in South America, and we're going to give this banana company a brand. We call it Patty and Albert, by coincidence. And it's important. So remember the brand. So we set up a banana company just to show you a bit about how this works. So Patty and Albert Banana Company, somewhere in South America, has made a big profit during 2017 and is projected the same for 2018, which is fantastic for the country because then you have a profit that you can tax and invest in that country. Well, if you're clever, which normally big corporations like Patty and Albert are, they set up a number of subsidiaries around the world. So one might be in Ireland, and to that company, subsidiary in Ireland, you need to pay a fee for the license to use the name Patty and Albert. So you move part of the profit to that country. And then, of course, you need to pay for insurance of the company and all its subsidiaries to another country. Let's assume Cyprus. In the third case, you might need to pay a fee for the use of infrastructure to move around the commodity, and let's say we move it to the Cayman Islands. So you move part of the profit over there. What happens, of course, is that the profit shrinks substantially. So there's much more less for you to tax in that company suddenly. But of course, that company needs to expand its operations. So Patty and Albert company wants to move into a new market or promote a big campaign to sell more bananas. So they need capital. So how do you get capital? Well, you have another subsidiary in the Cayman Islands that provides you with a loan. So you get a loan from your own subsidiary, and in some cases, that loan is even tax deductible in the country you're operating. So that's sort of a simple way to show how capital moves around in these tax havens and then suddenly shrinks the profits that you sort of can tax. Is this a big problem or not? It's very hard to get numbers on this, of course. So this is from Gabriel Zuckman, one of the leading scholars in this field, and it shows a graph of, on the top, something called the nominal tax, just to simplify it, in the US, which has moved from 50 all the way down to 35. But then in the bottom, you have the effective tax rate, so what's really being paid to US government. And then, of course, you get a gap, and that's a loss in tax revenue. And this is what the Paradise Leaks or about, in a sense, to unpack the very clever tax planning strategies of big companies around the world, and in a way, sort of shrink the tax that they're paying. There's one estimate. It's a rough estimate, but it's sort of the most robust ones by Gabriel Zuckman, that the global tax losses are estimated to $200 billion per year. And that's not the same as the amount of capital hidden in tax havens. This is just the loss of tax revenue around the world. And this is likely to be an underestimate. Now, why do I go through all this? I think it's fascinating. I mean, this is a fascinating world. It gets me a bit upset, but also intrigued. But then when thinking about ecosystems and ecosystem change, and here just to use the Amazon rainforest as a case. I mean, we know the Amazon rainforest has huge values in terms of biodiversity, etc. But we also know that it's one of the identified Earth system tipping points or tipping elements. So it helps to stabilize the climate system. Huge global ecosystem service. And we know from previous research from Brazilian researchers that the availability of credit loans is linked to increased deforestation. So it's not just what governments do, it's not just what consumers do, it's also access to capital that allows these companies to expand. We know that for a fact. So that's how we started our journey and started to think about it. What about this tax gap? What if we think about this tax gap as an indirect subsidy to companies operating in the biosphere? And there's a bit of a star there because it's not the correct technical term for indirect subsidies. I'm using the layman term here. But what do we look at the gap as a subsidy that we're providing to these companies in the way as they expand in the Amazon or in other parts of the world? So we looked into two sectors in Brazil, soy and beef, selected the 8 and 9 biggest companies, and said, let's look at the capital flows and the number of subsidiaries. Remember the banana example? Subsidiaries around the world? Okay, here we go. So what's the data on subsidiaries of these companies and how many of them are placed in tax havens? Before I do that, I need to give credit to my colleagues. So this is joint work with a number of people at SRC and other places. So Beatrice Krona, Alice Tariach, Jean-Baptiste, who's here, Geoffrey, Henrik Österblom, Jan Fischner, who's at the University of Amsterdam, Ana Paula Aguilar, and our research assistant Amar Kausovic, who has helped us look at the data and identify data. So this is work in review. So share with care. I'm not going to forbid you guys to take pictures, but share with care. This is still in review and it's preliminary. So let's look at the subsidiaries of these companies. What does that look like? Some of them have very few, like Amagi has very few. Some have a lot of subsidiaries, and many of them, they're in the black bar, located strategically in tax haven jurisdictions. That doesn't prove anything. I mean, if you're a big multinational company, of course you have subsidiaries around the world. I mean, it makes sense. So it doesn't prove anything. The challenge is, of course, to find another data on capital flows from and to Brazil to these companies. By coincidence, we actually did that for a limited period of time. So there was a law passed by the Brazilian government that forced big companies to register transfers of capital from outside of Brazil into the companies, the amount and from where. So by coincidence and a bit of hard work, we found hundreds of PDFs and we turned them into a database. But just for that period, because that law was abandoned later in 2011. So that's the only window we have. So we did that. And what are some results? Like how important are flows from tax haven jurisdictions to these companies? We did a bit of an infograph, not on company names, but on sectors. And you can see big flows from the Cayman Islands to companies operating in the soy sector. Smaller flows from the Bahamas, etc. But as a way to summarize it, we discovered that 70% of all foreign capital to companies operating and modifying the Amazon biome is flowing through tax haven jurisdictions, which we found extremely interesting. And the total sum would be 22 billion US dollars compared to the total amount of capital going through other jurisdictions. If you add that, the total would be 31.5. This is just an average, but it's very clear that some companies are using tax havens exclusively to move around capital to their operations, 100% in some cases. Is this a lot or a little? How much time do I have, Albert? Oh, cool. And that's how much is $22 billion to 8 companies? It's very difficult to know. You need other figures to compare. Is this key capital? Would these companies like tip over and go into bankruptcy if they don't get this capital? That would be like the hard question to ask. So we need figures to compare. And this is when it starts to get tricky when you're trying to unpack global drivers of change. So we wanted company profits per sector, right? So we want to know, like, this company in the soy sector in Brazil, what would be the profit for these years? And then we can compare with the flows from tax haven jurisdictions. That's not public data. You can't get it. Companies won't give it to you. How about getting an overview of company financial transfers from Brazil to subsidiaries in other countries, whether they're in tax haven jurisdictions or not? That's not public. You can't get that data. They won't share it. What about the internal financing of these companies per year? Like how much of their profits it's being distributed into the grain sector compared to the soy sector or beef sector, for example. That's not public either. So it's very hard to know. I mean, we have the figure. We have 70%. We have 22 billion. But there's no way to know how important it is. Not because we didn't want to figure it out. It's just because the data is not available and not shared with us as researchers. So that's a big problem. But we did find, and this is just the last weeks, in fact, some data in Brazil from the Brazilian Development Bank. And this is important capital for companies. So this is part of the Brazilian government's ambition to make Brazilian companies world leading in different sectors. So this is substantial contributions from the Brazilian government to these companies. And you see the graph there. It goes the y-axis, so it goes up all the way to $2.5 billion US dollars in 2010. And that's government disbursements. How big are tax haven financial flows compared to these disbursements? For the beef sector, not unsubstantial amount of money going to these companies, which we found interesting. How about the soy sector? It's the soy sector, so that's, again, disbursements from the Brazilian National Development Bank from 2001 to 2010, goes up to 800 million. How much are tax haven channeled flows of capital compared to these government disbursements? There will be a shift in scale here. Here we go. So that would be up to, 300% in the end, or 4 or 5 times the size, channeled through tax haven jurisdictions to these companies in comparison with government disbursements, which we know are important for these companies. So that's a way to start to unpack the importance of these capital flows. So that's how far we've come so far. It's an extremely exciting but very difficult and political sensitive space. I haven't shown many names of companies, for example. I mean, that was a choice we made. I just showed you in the first slide. But in terms of flows of capital and intermediaries, we have the data, but we chose to focus more on the sectors rather than the companies. Even though we have that data, we also have names of the banks involved, etc. But I think the key point here, I mean, I'm not an activist, even though I feel very strongly about the topic and why this is relevant for the Pecs network. Once you start to unpack these very difficult and highly politically sensitive global drivers, is first of all these discussions about tax havens that are in the media now, there's actually an environmental dimension to it that people haven't explored very much. I think it might be the fact, and this is a hypothesis, that tax havens, jurisdictions, and the use of them, and the way that companies are able to reduce the amount of taxes that they're paying may actually underpin hidden indirect subsidies to large scale social ecological change. We've just looked at Brazil and the Amazon now. What about other sectors? What about mining? What about deforestation in Indonesia? What about global oceans that Jean-Baptiste will talk about on Tuesday? There is an optimistic message, though, that there is an increasing pressure on these jurisdictions from the global community, and all policies that are currently being discussed to try to increase transparency in tax havens could actually have large-scale environmental benefits, in a sense. It would help close the tax gap, and it would allow, actually, these sort of indirect subsidies to sort of be removed or at least minimized. So that's a positive message. And then the third one related to this network, because I know Patti asked me to reflect on that, what role does Pecs play? And I think Pecs plays a critical role in providing good, solid, on-the-ground science of social ecological change. That's needed. Financial actors are asking for it, and policymakers as well, of course. But then the other thing that we've discovered, once we start looking into these global drivers, is that to be able to understand those, you need to start creating unexpected alliances with people or scholars we've never been in contact with before. So suddenly you find yourself sending emails to experts in accountants, corporate governance, investigative journalists, etc. So that, I mean, that those sort of unexpected alliances should be a priority if you're interested in unpacking these messy global drivers. That's the only way to make a push and to increase our understanding. So that was it. Thank you.
So I would like to ask both of you to reflect a bit on this interplay between the global perspective in the initiatives you have been involved, in the research you have been involved, but also the place. And how you see this back and forth, this relational value of the place to global in your experience. What can you share with us?
Okay. I believe that the connections we have showed, of course, in my presentation, I gave it in a scope which is macro-regional to global. But we believe that these connections are absolutely valid at the local scale. That's probably no news for everyone. But what I think is very important is that if you have a system in which you analyze your global aspects of nature and the things you get from it, and the drivers, and good quality of life, etc., at the local level only, it will work. But it will have cross-scale interactions with them that you cannot possibly miss. I was really impressed by Victor's presentation, because it looks like all these local studies we do in Latin America, for example, the study I presented as an example, right? You just cannot explain things locally. You're just missing the whole point if explained locally. You need to understand the local mechanisms. You need to understand many local cases, because otherwise you resign to the possibility of scaling up from local systems. But if you don't look at the cross-scale interactions, which are very asymmetrical, I would say, you just lose the picture.
Okay, thank you. And this also links to your point of the power relation, which is more than obvious from Victor's presentation. So I don't know if you want to share something additionally, Victor.
No, I mean, I agree, and I think we're all in agreement that this sort of global data and global perspective is useless without having a local understanding of what happens. Whatever you're doing needs to be anchored in a local context. The challenge, I believe, in at least in the research networks that I've seen, is that it's very sort of based in the local, and that we're all struggling to make that jump up to the global without losing the local. And I think it requires different skill sets and different unexpected alliances, but I think we're all moving into that direction.
And one other issue that struck me from both presentations is that one part is the data part that you showed, and the data part that you showed also for your study case. But there's all this intellectual evolving, which seems that we are right now in this very interesting moment where we have large networks such as Pecs, Ecoservices, Future Earth, and the CANs, which are all in research, but we have also IBES, which is this platform that is kind of pushing us to think faster and harder because the train goes so fast. So there seems to be a very interesting synergy from each of us, a local place-based thinking and development, then the role of this research network, and then the role of these global initiatives. So in your experience, what is the gain of this global to local interaction, like in the thinking, in the creative process of really understanding and really, advancing once more, really identifying the boundaries, going beyond the boundaries, going beyond what we all think, going beyond the things that everybody has accepted?
Well, I would say that you're right in saying that there is a convergence of thinking in many different research initiatives around the world, large-scale ones, in the need of considering different streams, unexpected partners, different streams of knowledge, different practitioners, different interests. I think that in trying to do this, which we probably all in this room agree with, otherwise we wouldn't be here, I think the role of the local is giving texture, is giving examples, and not examples in the same, this is one example just to make my case, which I already made, no matter what example, is giving inspiration of how things can work, is giving texture, is giving concrete numbers to things that at the global level are a little bit dry and abstract. And also is giving example of things that definitely don't work. Some things very ideally work at the very global level, but when you start looking at the texture, you start aggregating the local texture, it just doesn't work. And also, socially, it provides a way, a powerful way, in which people on the ground start relating to all these ideas. Because we shouldn't be fooling ourselves. If all those ideas are not bought somehow by people on the ground, are not going to have any practical implications. Maybe beautifully, conceptually, but they are not going to change anything.
Thanks. I mean, in addition to that, something that we've been thinking a lot about in our research team and at the Resilience Center, when you work at that global scale and in a exploring new terrain, in a sense, you're moving into a descriptive sort of analysis of these, we call them patterns of the Anthropocene, which is great to get that sort of descriptive elaboration of what this new world looks like. But then the next step, going more into the analytical understanding of it. Like, okay, so we know we have these global flows of trade, but how vulnerable are these to systemic shocks, for example? Then you need to move from the descriptive to the analytical, and that's also a difficult jump to make.
Great, thank you very much. So let's take some questions from the audience. A few for Victor and a few for Sandra. So, okay. So I will read a few for Sandra, and then you may want to answer them together. So it's about the IBES framework. does nature ever have a voice on the political stage? That does depend upon recognition by people? If so, is any way that we can conceptualize this? And then another question is it now the time for replacing the concept of ecosystem services or nature's contributions to people?
Okay, I'm not sure I fully understand the first question. Nature is the living world, right?
A voice for nature.
Okay, oh yeah.
Nature has a voice for itself. Who speaks for nature?
Oh, I don't know if that's a trap question. I think that the only ones that can speak to ourselves is ourselves, right? So the fact that we explicitly recognize the intrinsic value of nature, so that's nature for itself and by itself, not necessarily tied to any usefulness to us. I think that is the closest we can have to a voice of nature in the framework. So the framework doesn't say everything in nature is either important for us, useful for us, or it doesn't exist, we don't care. We explicitly recognize it. Of course, we are much more able to deal with those things that are meaningful to us, important to us, instrumentally or relationally. I think that a lot of the thinking about nature by itself and its own right comes now in what we call relational values with nature. And the other one, okay. Nature's contributions to people is not intending to replace ecosystem services. Is a wider umbrella. The ecosystem service concept has been seminal, important, very useful, and spawned a lot of research and policy. But a number of social actors that IBES needed to bring on the table just don't resonate with it, don't understand it, or just reject it straight away. From in different knowledge systems and from inside the social sciences and humanities. So we needed a more inclusive concept, a wider umbrella under which there is a coexistence, a conversion, an interweaving of different concepts. One of them is ecosystems, goods, and services. Others are the nature's gifts, nature of relations, reciprocal relationships. We intend to be simply more plural.
Okay. Thank you. And so, and we probably will be hearing other perspectives on the voices of nature, for example, in the biocultural dialogue symposium we will be having in a few days. So now for Victor, we have several questions related to the policies associated to these tax havens, right? So if these policies are implemented to prevent tax havens, will countries or states create maybe other incentives to attract other types of corporations in different ways? For example, the US has done this by creating tax exemptions to tax rebates in the case of Texas as a prime example. Another related question is that what are the chances that your own estimation for policies remaining tax havens to be enacted and enforced? So we have the estimations, but then what will happen? I'm sure these powerful companies will fight and try to keep these privileges. And then a very specific thing about your study case, the soy and the beef. Because soy is annual, maybe there's something very special about soy, that soy can really go back and forth quickly, and maybe the beef is a longer term process that maybe has different implications?
I don't have any response to the last question. I'd be happy to talk about that more, because I'm not sure really what the implications are. About the other questions regarding enforcement and whether it's realistic that it will happen, and what are other ways that jurisdictions or governments will attract funding in other ways, I think that's a clear risk. And if you look into the literature about these jurisdictions and how to address those people, I mean, we realize that we're seeing this as a result of the global tax system failing, essentially. There's something wrong in the way we think about taxes and the way we are extracting taxes from private individuals and companies. That's what's creating all these loopholes. So there needs to be a rethink of the global tax system, which is going to be very difficult. You need to get all countries and jurisdictions on board. If you don't get them on board, there's a very strong incentive for one jurisdiction, and it increases with the number of other countries joining to skip it because it attracts capital. So that's a very difficult challenge. But another thing that people in this field talk about, and it is actually possible, is the creation of a world financial registry to make sure to track the flows of capital and who owns them and where in the world they are. It's a massive task, but in terms of the technologies that we have already to track financial flows, it's already there, but it's about getting the political momentum. And then the third thing that is being mentioned in this field that I find interesting is that another way to address this is to kill the supply of tax planning services. This is a big industry that's making a lot of capital of supporting aggressive tax planning, and there are actually possibilities to just try to increase the cost of providing these services in the global economy. I should also say, I didn't mention that, tax planning is not illegal, right? I mean, some tax evasion is illegal, but tax planning is not illegal in a sense. We need to keep it in mind. So I think reforming the global tax system, creating a world financial registry, and then trying to strangle supply of tax planning services are three ways to approach this.
Thank you. Maybe we can take a couple short questions, or maybe one more. Yes, yeah, I can do it. No problem. So let's take one last question for Sandra, and maybe a wrap up together from either of you. So the recognition of these very different sources of knowledges and of the need of having them in a way integrated or reconciled does require a very different approach to the way we do science and we do research and we do teaching. So, the question, are we prepared as researchers and as academic institutions to really address this change of paradigm, to really integrate the different perspectives? And otherwise, how can we transit through this change in very different way to do science, and would institutions such as IBES help in this transition? And I guess I would expand the question to you, no? In the case of all these new tools and these new perspectives, are we prepared, and who could be our partners in this transition?
Okay, the very short answer of that question is no. We are not prepared. But if we wait until we are prepared, we'll never will. I think the very important message here is we are all recognizing this need from very different angles. So we are prepared to do it, and we have started to doing it. However badly, we are still already doing it. In terms of the ways of doing science, I think the interweaving is the key. It doesn't mean that if you work in your spectrophotometer, mass spectrophotometer, looking at chlorophyll, you have to stop to do that and do some consultation in how much chlorophyll is in the leaf. That is not about that. It's the fact that this knowledge has to be interweaved with others, has to be considered as one stream of knowledge together with other streams. And there's not a very, very strong this is good and this is bad. That's the main message. I think there are a number of ways we can do it. Definitely needs, in the research system, it definitely needs a change in the valuation criteria. That the interweaving and the consultation and the different knowledge on the table gets valued in the research evaluation system, particularly for young researchers. The other is in teaching, definitely, and definitely in very large-scale initiatives like IBES or IPCC. I mean, these kind of things just doesn't fit well with the crazy timings we all have to tolerate, right? I think that as these international initiatives get used to this, they have to change. But I think there is big progress. I mean, if you look at previous initiatives, they wouldn't even think of having an explicit consideration of different knowledge systems. So however imperfectly we are doing this, however it's too hectic and too little, but at least it's there, at least it's the table. At least nobody now in the intergovernmental processes argues against the need of the knowledge systems. So I think there is great progress, and we learn as we work. There's no other way.
I mean, just a kind of reflection from our work exploring financial dimensions is that we are ready. I think we are ready to collaborate with that community, and we're willing to listen and learn. The problem is that they are not ready. We're like weird environmental people normally, so it's very hard to find people with the sort of skills and understanding the financial systems and financial instruments, etc., to actually get involved on these topics. I think it's improving, but very, very, very slowly. So I think that's a key challenge for us when we move into this space, to find good collaborators. So I mean, if you find a collaborator in the financial domain that's willing and that takes sustainability seriously, don't let her or him go. They're hard to find, really hard to find, and that's the alliances we need to create.
Well, with this, I would like to thank very much Sandra and Victor. Thank you very much.